This is the Arturia KeyLab 88 Mark III, their new flagship MIDI controller. Should you buy it? Well, it depends. Look, there's no doubt that the new Arturia KeyLab 88 Mark III is one of the best MIDI controller keyboards that you can buy. However, the question of whether you should buy it or not is not that straightforward. It partially depends on what you'll be using it for, what you already own, and how it compares to other models out there, including those from Arturia's own range. We'll definitely be covering all of that later on in this video. But first of all, I want to let you know that although Arturia sent me this keyboard to try out for this video, they're not paying me. And more importantly, they don't get to say what I've got to say. In fact, they may not even like some of the things I have to say later on. However, this video is sponsored by DistroKid. Follow the VIP link in the description down below to get 7% off an already amazing price to distribute your music to the world. One area where I feel Arturia absolutely nail it is with the overall quality of the hardware. I noticed it with the Mark II when I bought it about 4 years ago. And by the way, that's really stood the test of time with no broken or loose knobs or anything like that. It's still working as it did on day one, and this feels exactly the same. Now they do this in a few different ways. First of all, we've got this metal chassis that feels really nice and adds some nice weight to the keyboard overall. You've also got some nice touches like the wooden trims on the end, and all of the knobs and buttons and sliders all feel nice and premium, as you would expect from a keyboard in this range. Now, one of the areas I noticed it as well, and the same was true with the Mark II, is when you attach the two accessories that come with this keyboard, which don't come with others in this range, and that is the music stand and the laptop stand. Not only are the accessories in themselves a nice quality, but as you're attaching them, you notice that everything fits really nice and snug. There's no rattling or looseness, and at the same time they're really easy to fit. So overall, I'm gonna say that this hasn't necessarily improved since the previous generation, but it was already very, very good with the previous generation. And it seems the same with this one too. The star of the show for me with this model in this range is definitely the fully weighted 88 key keyboard. First of all, I love having 88 keys, not only when I'm playing things like piano parts and I want the full range, but also when I'm using virtual instruments with key switches. Everything's immediately accessible without me having to switch octaves, etc. And that's kind of a workflow bonus for me. Secondly, I absolutely love using weighted keys. Most of the time, that is, for most instruments. Now, if you've never used a weighted keyboard before, basically they kind of mimic the feel of an acoustic piano. And when you press down on the key, there's a kind of a resistance. It feels like it's sort of balanced on a pivot. And that's really nice, in my opinion, for expression. I definitely feel I'm more expressive with this type of keyboard. However, not all weighted keyboards are equal. With this generation, we've got the new Fatar TP110. In terms of feel compared to other keyboards, I would describe it as still being reasonably heavy. Now, I happen to really like that, but not everybody does. Now, I'll also say that if it was a bit lighter, I'd probably be happy with that as well. If you're the kind of person, however, who's going to be very finicky and wants something just right for your playing, then this is an occasion when I recommend you get down to your local music store and try this before you buy it, because it may not be for everyone. However, I think most people may have trouble discerning much difference, and you'd have to say this feels like a very high quality keyboard. Now, one occasion when I don't like to use weighted keys is when I'm playing drum parts. So I'm always happy to see that Arturia keyboards do have drum pads included. Now, in this generation, they've gotten a little bit bigger, and I feel that they're a little more sensitive than previous generations. However, we do have less of them. My Mark II has 16, but here on the Mark III, we see 12 pads in 4 banks. And we'll be discussing that a little bit later when we compare this to some other keyboards. So next to the pads, we see a collection of buttons which include access to features like the chord and arpeggio features, but many of them are dedicated transport controls for your DAW. Now, this is super useful because sometimes, depending on where your keyboard is, your DAW or your mouse may be out of reach. So this gives you control over things like playback, recording, undo, save, all of those useful features as you're recording a new part. Now, it's compatible with many popular DAWs out of the box, but it also has both MCU and Huey modes, so it may be compatible with other DAWs which aren't listed. You need to check out your DAW to see its compatibility in that way. Now, it's also much easier now to switch between different DAW modes because of the new color display. New to this generation is the full color 3.5-inch display. We saw this appear on the 61 key version a few months ago. Now, I find it's particularly an advantage when you're using Arturia's own software, so things like Analog Lab, which comes with this keyboard, or some of their other instruments. I also find it particularly useful when I'm changing settings. It's a much more pleasurable experience going in and selecting a different DAW, for example, than it was with the previous display. However, since this display was launched on other models, it hasn't been without its critics, and we'll discuss that later on. One thing I appreciate is that when I'm using one of the metal pitch or mod wheels on this keyboard, I get instant feedback on that color display showing me the current value. The same is true for the 9 sliders and endless encoders on the right hand side. And by the way, you don't actually have to adjust these to see the value. You can simply touch them and it will show you the current value. Now, these sliders and encoders are particularly useful when you're using one of Arturia's instruments, since they're usually assigned to one of the useful controls or some of the useful controls on those instruments. They're also useful when you're in DAW mode because they can be used as faders and pan controls. At the rear, we can see that although we can power this keyboard with the power brick, in most cases you're probably going to power it via the USB-C connection here, which will be connected most likely to a computer. We can also see at the back that we've got a couple of good old-fashioned MIDI in and out connections, as well as sustain, expression, and a couple of auxiliary connections for different pedals and things. There's definitely less connectivity than the previous generation, where we saw things like CV connections for your old synths and things. I believe that Arturia almost kind of had to do this. We'll discuss that later, however. In terms of software, well, you'll be using the MIDI control center to customize this keyboard. You can change the sensitivity of the keys, for example, or you can change the functionality of some of the buttons, as well as some aesthetics like the color of the pads and the color of some of the buttons as well. Super easy to create profiles in there and then transfer them over to the keyboard itself. In terms of other software, well, you get the full Analog Lab Pro, as well as Mini V, Piano V, augmented strings, a nice plate reverb, and a selection of other software and subscriptions or trial subscriptions from other companies as well. All of that does add a nice bit of value to this keyboard. Okay, so now we know what it does, what its features and specs are. I'd like to discuss how this stands up against other models in Arturia's range, the previous generation, and also one particular model by another company that I know you're all going to compare this to. Well, we're going to discuss all of that in just a moment, but first of all, I'd like to remind you that if you're releasing music to places like Spotify, Amazon, Google Play, etc., don't forget to check the link out in the description down below to our sponsor DistroKid. If you follow that VIP link, you'll get 7% off of your first year of membership. Now, in comparing this to the previous generation, which was much loved by me, I suspect, I don't know, I've got no inside information, but I do suspect that Arturia had to take a couple of calculated risks and remove some features in order to accommodate the new color display, which is an extra cost, a cost in R&D, a cost in support, etc. And this is the key and keep this keyboard at roughly the same price as the previous generation. Now, I actually don't know what the price of this is going to be on launch, so you'll have to follow the link in the description down below to find that out. But in order to do that, they probably calculated that the vast majority of you don't use things, for example, like the CV connections on the previous generation. Leave a comment down below to let me know if that's the case. In fact, do you even know what a CV connection is? Will you miss it? The other thing, of course, that they made a sacrifice with was the number of pads. Now, I do feel the quality has increased, however. It may even be the fact that these are bigger pads, which has added to the sensitivity of their response. However, I also have to say that I don't think I've ever used 16 pads in one composition. Maybe you do, and if that's the case, then this might not be the keyboard for you, especially if you use CV connections as well. But in the vast majority of cases, I would rather take the quality over the quantity, and at most I probably use 7 or 8 pads at a time. Let me know your experience in the comments down below. So if you're weighing this up against the 61 key version, well, it's a little bit more than just a different number of keys. However, that may of course be important to you. Also keep in mind that with the 61 key version, you don't get these fully weighted keys as you do on this version. Those are more synth style keys. They're very nice synth style keys, but very, very different to this keyboard. Now, the other main difference is the fact that you do get this music stand and laptop shelf with this version. And if you're a working musician and taking this out and playing live, those things may be particularly important to you. But those are the basic differences between those two models. Now, to add to the confusion a little bit, Arturia also have another range of KeyLab keyboards, which is the Essential range. So you may be wondering, what's the difference between the KeyLab Essential 88 Mark III and this one? Well, quite a lot actually. First of all, you don't get the weighted keys in the Essential range, so they've actually just got the synth action keys. Secondly, you don't get the color screen. You get less pads on that again with just 8 pads, and you don't get anywhere near the number of connections. You just get very basic connections. And I have to say, overall, if you were to try the two out side by side, you would immediately notice a difference in quality. Now, that's not to say the Essential range is in any way bad quality. It's just that it's made with a particular budget in mind. If you don't care about any of these things in terms of the features of this particular range, then maybe that's the keyboard for you. But definitely you would notice the difference between the two. Inevitably, this keyboard will be compared to the Native Instruments S88 Mark III. And I reckon even if I had the most dedicated evangelical Arturia employee with me right now, and I asked them which of these keyboards has the best color display, even they would have to admit that the Native Instruments definitely has the superior display. And this display, whilst very welcome, is quite underwhelming in comparison. However, they would probably also be quick to point out that this does not sell at the same price. That's important when we're comparing apples to apples, or, well, let's leave Apple out of this anyway. Now, the other aspect of this is there's some features this has which that doesn't. The pads, for example, the sliders, which you may find useful. I would say the main decision you have to make when you're weighing these things up as well, apart from price, is that the Native Instruments keyboard is really good if you're in that ecosystem, if you use a lot of Native Instruments software and instruments. But this, in my opinion, may be better for a general keyboard. Of course, it excels with Arturia software, but for general MIDI use, I feel this slightly has the edge still for me. I do wish there was a bigger and nicer touch display, just like an iPad basically in there, but I'm not willing to pay that much extra for it. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. I personally feel that for me, the choice of which MIDI controller keyboard I use in my studio is really important, and that's because I increasingly make use of virtual instruments. If that's the kind of thing you're going to be doing a lot, then I recommend that you do think this through and perhaps spend a little more to make sure that you've got a piece of equipment that is both going to last a long time and work well within your workflow. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I'm Mike. I hope you're well, and I'll see you in the next video.